Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most absurdly divine contradictions in history, the medieval papacy. A time when the holiest seat in Christendom was less about salvation and more about scandal, strategy, and silk-lined debauchery. These weren't just popes. They were kings in robes, generals with incense, and in some cases, glorified soap opera characters who moonlighted as God's official representatives on earth. So before you imagine halos and harps, buckle up. We're headed somewhere holier than thou and twice as messy. Before we get too deep into incense and intrigue, take a second to like the video and subscribe. But only if you enjoy your history served with sarcasm, scandal, and a bit of spiritual side-eye. And hey, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Because let's be honest, nothing unites the world quite like a well-timed papal disaster. Now, dim the lights, silence the confessions, and let's begin tonight's journey into the throne that was supposed to lead souls to heaven, but occasionally detoured through hell on earth. No one wakes up thinking, I want to be Pope. Unless you lived in the Middle Ages. Unless your cousin was a cardinal, your father owned half of Rome, and your spiritual resume consisted of Latin lessons, fencing accidents, and a particularly pious-looking portrait. In that case, congratulations, you were practically overqualified. The papal throne, that sacred chair supposedly carved from humility and divine purpose, was in practice a political armrest upholstered with gold, blood, and favors. It was less a calling and more a career move, an inheritance, a gamble disguised as God's will. And boy, was it a gamble. Because once you slipped into those holy robes, preferably without tripping on the embroidery, you didn't just lead prayers. You led armies, negotiated with kings, occasionally poisoned a relative or two. You were the CEO of Western Christendom, the divine HR department, and the spiritual bouncer of eternity, all rolled into one. But don't let the doves and choirs fool you. Behind the velvet curtains of the Vatican was a backstage teeming with ambition, bribery, and enough family feuds to make a royal court blush. The College of Cardinals? Less a group of devout elders and more a medieval reality show with incense. Every election was a circus. Every pope, a wild card. And the stakes? Eternal, supposedly. Because the one who held the keys to heaven often had skeletons in his wine cellar. Some came in young, full of ideals and scripture. Others came in drunk, metaphorically, sometimes literally. Once elected, you could kiss your morals goodbye and your mistresses hello. The papal office wasn't a sanctuary, it was a stage. And some men played their parts with Shakespearean flair. Others, well, let's just say the devil probably took notes. Saint Peter may have been a fisherman, but by the 10th century, his chair was swimming with sharks. Papal candidates weren't chosen for piety. They were chosen because their uncle had a militia, or their cousin controlled the grain supply, or because they were the least offensive option in a room full of men who had all blackmailed each other into a stalemate. And once seated, the Holy Father could excommunicate emperors, crown kings, and rewrite the rules of war and salvation. It was power, raw, unchecked, divine power, and it didn't always land in holy hands. In fact, sometimes it landed in the hands of teenage boys, or mercenaries in disguise, or men who prayed with one hand and poisoned with the other. Because here's the thing no one wants to put in stained glass. The medieval papacy wasn't just a seat of moral authority. It was the most hotly contested throne in Europe. And everyone wanted a turn. God may have been watching, but power was whispering in Latin behind closed doors. And in the chapters ahead, we're going to meet the popes who turned confession into corruption, and grace into scandal. Starting with a teenage nobleman who treated the Vatican like a tavern. Stay tuned. If you ever wondered what would happen if a frat boy inherited the keys to heaven, wonder no more, because the year was 955, and Rome had just promoted a teenager to supreme spiritual authority. 18 years old, crown on his head, ego in the clouds, and absolutely no idea how to keep his robes clean or his scandals quiet. His name was Octavian, which already sounds like someone born to break furniture, but history would remember him as Pope John XII, the holy disaster with a wine habit and a very flexible interpretation of celibacy. He was elected pope the same way one might be elected prom king: political favors, family pressure, and zero theological qualifications. The Roman nobility didn't want a shepherd. They wanted a puppet. And young Octavian, raised in wealth, flattery, and boredom, was the perfect candidate. After all, why let a monk lead Christendom when you could have a hormonal heir with gambling debts? John XII treated the papacy not as a burden of divine responsibility but as a personal amusement park, one with sacred relics, unlocked treasure chests, and zero adult supervision. Within weeks of his coronation, the late Ran Palace had transformed from a seat of holiness into a Roman bachelor pad with nicer drapes. Sermons gave way to feasts. Blessings turned into drinking games. And the line between altar and afterparty completely erased. He gambled. He drank. He toasted pagan gods at Catholic banquets. Yes, you heard that right. Pagan gods. Imagine being so bad at your job that you celebrate your competitors. The palace walls, once adorned with symbols of sacrifice and resurrection, now echoed with the sounds of laughter, dice, and the occasional scandalous moan. Mistresses came and went, some married, some nuns, some probably just passing through. One chronicler claimed he turned the sacred halls into a brothel, which sounds exaggerated until you remember this is the same man who allegedly ordained a deacon in a stable. While drunk, medieval chroniclers, not known for their humor, ran out of synonyms for depraved. One referred to him as living like a satyr, which in polite medieval Latin translates to, "This man makes Bacchus look like a monk." But John wasn't just an embarrassment in bed and banquet. He was a political nightmare. He had enemies mutilated. One lost his eyes, another his tongue, and when he wasn't torturing people or betraying allies, he was busy asking the Holy Roman Emperor for help, only to stab him in the back weeks later. Diplomacy was not his strong suit. Treachery, however, was a language he spoke fluently, right after slurred Latin and incoherent flirtation. His reign was chaos wrapped in velvet. He wasn't a pope. He was a warning. Eventually, the German Emperor Otto I had enough. He stormed into Rome like a disapproving father, deposed John, and installed someone slightly more sober. But John, in true medieval soap opera fashion, made a comeback. He bribed, threatened, and slithered his way back onto the throne, proving that even in the 10th century, bad leadership was hard to get rid of. And then came the ending, or rather, the punchline. In the year 964, Pope John XII died, allegedly of a stroke, while in bed with a married woman, because of course he did. Some said it was divine punishment. Others suspected the woman's husband had a more hands-on interpretation of vengeance. Either way, John exited the world much as he had lived in it, mid-scandal, mid-sin, and mid-seduction. His legacy wasn't theological. It was theatrical. He didn't write encyclicals. He wrote headlines. And not the good kind. The church, embarrassed but still breathing, tried to erase him gently. But history and scandal have long memories. Pope John XII remains the prototype for every how not to be Pope seminar ever whispered in Vatican hallways. A cautionary tale in silk and sin. And as we move forward in our story, just remember, if you think he was bad, wait till you meet the one who sold the papacy like a used mattress. We're just getting warmed up. If the papacy were a job interview, Benedict IX would be the guy who showed up late, spilled wine on the resume, insulted the receptionist, and still got hired. 3 times. Yes, 3. Because when God allegedly closes a door, Benedict kicks it back open, saunters in with a smirk, and demands a second and third chance, preferably with gold, wine, and plausible deniability. His reign, or rather reigns, were less a divine calling and more a medieval sitcom. Except no one was laughing. Not the clergy, not the citizens, and certainly not the theologians forced to explain how that guy kept coming back. Let's rewind. It's 1032. Rome smells of incense, politics, and mild treason. Enter Benedict IX, a noble by birth, a pope by nepotism, and a walking scandal by temperament. He's roughly 20 years old, though some sources say younger, which is already too young to lead Christendom unless you're auditioning for Pope Idol, Youth Edition. He was elected not because of piety or scholarship, but because his family, the powerful Tusculani, basically owned the papal slot. You know, like a family parking space, but for souls. And oh, what he did with it. Benedict's first reign was a parade of disgrace. Whispers of orgies, echoes of bribery, and the unsettling sound of cardinals sighing loudly into their rosaries. He treated the Vatican like a summer villa, a place to relax, indulge, and occasionally remember he was supposed to be celibate. Accusations poured in like communion wine. Simony, adultery, public indecency, and more than one instance of wait, he did what in the basilica. Eventually, even his allies choked on their incense. An uprising forced him out in 1044. Most disgraced popes would take the hint. Resign. Reflect. Maybe write sad psalms in exile. Not Benedict. He came back, because apparently, shame had a revolving door. The Roman nobility, trying to clean up the mess, had installed a replacement. But Benedict returned, claimed the throne, and turned the Vatican into a soap opera, complete with betrayal, excommunications, and possibly a love triangle. And then came the plot twist. In 1045, Benedict decided to sell the papacy. You heard that right. He sold it. To his godfather. Yes, the holiest office in the Christian world, bartered like a used mule at a Sunday market, in exchange for gold and what was reportedly a very comfortable countryside retirement. His godfather, who conveniently became Pope Gregory VI, took over, presumably with a deep breath and a mop. This, naturally, did not go well, because, again, Benedict changed his mind. Maybe the gold ran out. Maybe the retirement villa didn't have good wine. Maybe he just missed the thrill of sinning in silk. Whatever the reason, in 1047, Benedict came back. Again. He marched into Rome, reclaimed the papal palace, and declared himself pope for the 3rd time, proving once and for all that denial is not just a river in Egypt. It's a career strategy in the medieval Vatican. This final reign was as chaotic as the last. The Church, exhausted and visibly twitching, begged the Holy Roman Emperor for help. And by 1048, Benedict was finally removed for good. Excommunicated, banished, erased from the holy calendar of acceptable mistakes. But not from history. Benedict IX remains the only man to have been pope 3 times, and the only one to treat the papacy like a sublet. His legacy is not one of theology or reform. It's a cautionary tale wrapped in silk robes and dipped in sacrilege. A man so scandalous that even his resignation came with a price tag. And as we turn the page, the chaos only deepens. Because if you thought having one pope was confusing, wait until you meet the time three claimed the throne at once. Stay with me. At some point in your life, you've probably made a bad decision. Maybe it was texting an ex. Maybe it was cutting your own bangs. But unless you've ever dug up a 9-month-old corpse, dressed it in papal robes, propped it on a throne, and put it on trial, congratulations. You're still doing better than Pope Stephen VI. The year was 897. Rome was a carnival of chaos, where the line between divine justice and petty revenge was not just blurry, it was actively being stomped on in liturgical shoes. Enter Stephen VI, a man who took the concept of grudges and turned it into religious performance art. His target? Pope Formosus, a man who had committed the unforgivable crime of existing. Well, that, and allegedly taking the papacy when someone else wanted it. Now, Formosus had been dead for months, buried, decaying, minding his own decomposed business. But Stephen, he wanted a trial, and not a symbolic one, a literal trial. So he did what any rational spiritual leader would do. He dug Formosus up. Yes, exhumed him. Dressed him in papal vestments, sat his corpse on a throne, and assigned a deacon to serve as defense attorney for a skeleton. Let that sink in. Someone was paid to argue on behalf of a rotting, silent pope, with a straight face. In Latin, the charges? Perjury, illegally ascending to the papacy, being, apparently, spiritually inconvenient. Formosus, for his part, said nothing. He was, after all, dead. The trial proceeded like some nightmarish medieval puppet show. Stephen shouted. The clergy looked uncomfortable. The corpse wobbled gently under its robes. The air probably smelled like bad theology and worse decisions. Predictably, the verdict was guilty. Stephen then ordered Formosus stripped of his garments, his papal fingers, the ones used for blessings, cut off, and his body tossed unceremoniously into the Tiber River. Because nothing says mature leadership like aquatic corpse disposal. The reaction? Shock. Outrage. Even by 9th century Roman standards, and those were low, this was too far. Riots erupted. Clergy whispered. Bishops stared at their sandals, wondering what sins led them here. The public, who had witnessed decades of corruption, finally muttered, "Okay, this is too much." The spectacle had crossed a line, not of doctrine, of dignity. Stephen VI had hoped to humiliate a political rival from beyond the grave. Instead, he embarrassed the church itself. He was arrested within months, strangled in prison by someone who, presumably, had seen enough Monty Python. His successor, Pope Romanus, promptly reversed the whole fiasco, dredged Formosus back out of the river, and reburied him, this time with honors. One imagines the grave was double-locked, just in case, but the damage was done. The Cadaver Synod entered history not as a theological turning point, but as a grotesque parody of justice. It revealed the festering rot beneath the velvet of papal politics, a world where grudges outlived bodies and where power made madness seem like liturgy. The church would go on. Pretend it hadn't just watched a corpse be convicted. Pretend the throne of St. Peter hadn't become a stage for horror. But deep down, everyone knew. You can exhume a body. But once you've made God's representative on earth look like the villain in a gothic ghost story, you can't exactly walk that back. And if you think this was the church's lowest moment, oh, sweet soul. Next, we enter the age of women who ruled from behind the throne. Not with swords, with sons. It's time for the pornocracy. Let's say you wake up in 10th century Rome. The streets are muddy. The basilicas echo with politics disguised as prayer. And somewhere, in a silk-draped bedroom not far from the Lateran Palace, a woman stretches, sips wine, and decides who the next pope will be. No, she's not a nun. She's not even clergy. She's Marozia, noblewoman, mistress, political mastermind, and unofficial CEO of the Catholic Church. Welcome to the pornocracy, Latin for rule of the harlots. Though let's be honest, the real obscenity wasn't the sex. It was the power. In this era, holy authority didn't flow from divine election or theological brilliance. It flowed from bedrooms, bloodlines, and backdoor deals, sometimes quite literally. The papacy wasn't a calling. It was an inheritance. A pawn. A weekend appointment penciled in between banquets and betrayals. At the center of it all was the Theophylact family, Rome's unofficial royal court. They didn't wear crowns. They didn't need to. They had sons to elevate, enemies to poison, and lovers to place in pulpits. Marozia, daughter of Theophylact, granddaughter of someone equally rich and ruthless, was the queen maker. Smart, seductive, and utterly unbothered by hypocrisy, she didn't just influence papal politics, she created it. One pope was her lover. Another was her son. Yes, you heard that right. She gave birth to Pope John XI. Let's take a moment to let that sink in. The Vicar of Christ, the Bishop of Rome, the Holy Father, also someone's literal son. Born of a liaison between Marozia and Pope Sergius III, who, to be fair, probably wasn't planning a baptism when he slipped into her chambers. Historians argue whether the affair was consensual, coercive, or somewhere in the morally ambiguous fog of medieval patriarchy. What's certain is this: for decades, the papacy was less a spiritual beacon and more a dynastic puppet show, with the strings pulled by women who understood power better than any cardinal. The church's moral compass didn't break. It was sold, polished, and passed around like a particularly controversial chalice. The Lateran Palace hosted banquets, assignations, and more than a few whispered meetings involving poisoned wine and forged documents. Cardinals nodded, Rome watched, and no one dared breathe too loudly, lest their name end up scratched from the will or worse, elevated to pope. Because in this era, the worst punishment wasn't damnation. It was promotion. One papal corpse had already been tried in court. Now, living popes were appointed for their obedience, removed for their independence, and occasionally strangled in the night for being inconvenient. If you think the word pornocracy is harsh, remember, it wasn't about sex. It was about who held the reins. And in the 10th century, it wasn't Saint Peter. It was Marozia, her sisters, her rivals, the women behind the throne who wielded more control than any cardinal dared admit. They didn't wear mitres. They didn't chant Latin, but they ruled ruthlessly, effectively, and in full command of the chessboard. And when the church finally tried to reclaim its dignity, it did so not through confession or reform, but through more intrigue, more violence, and an endless series of elections that made Game of Thrones look like Sunday school. The pornocracy eventually collapsed under the weight of its own audacity, but not before leaving a permanent stain on the papal robes, one that even centuries of incense couldn't scrub clean. And as we leave the velvet shadows of Roman bedrooms, we head toward an era where the Pope didn't flee sin, he fled Rome. Next stop, exile. Wine. France. The Avignon papacy awaits. You expect a breakup to be messy. You don't expect it to involve an entire city. But in 1309, the Pope looked at Rome, its mobs, its corruption, its inconvenient assassinations, and said, "You know what? I think I'll be somewhere with better wine." And with that, he packed his robes, his ring, and a suspicious amount of silverware, and moved the entire papacy to France. Officially, it was for safety. Unofficially, it was for control. Thus began the Avignon papacy, or as Roman locals might have called it, that time our spiritual leader ghosted us and shacked up with the French monarchy. For the next 70 years, the Pope no longer ruled from St. Peter's Basilica. He ruled from a riverside palace in Avignon, a town more known for rosé than relics. It wasn't just a relocation. It was a rebranding. And oh, how the brand changed. The papal court, once austere and cloaked in ritual, began to sparkle. Literally, silks draped the halls. Tapestries thick enough to silence dissent lined the walls. Personal chefs arrived. Entertainers. Exotic pets. There were dining halls big enough to host a famine and wine cellars deep enough to drown theological objections. Some popes during this era were decent administrators. Some were spiritual. Most were French. Coincidence? Hardly. The French crown had essentially co-opted the papacy, not with war, but with subtle strings of loyalty, flattery, and suggestions written on gilded parchment. Every new pope, somehow, just happened to be a Francophile. Roman cardinals watched from afar like abandoned exes, muttering into their incense burners. And the people? Well, they were confused. Pilgrims showed up to Rome expecting blessings and found only pigeons. St. Peter's windows were empty. The Lateran palace echoed like a ghost house. Even the relics seemed to sulk. Meanwhile, in Avignon, the Vatican built a new palace, one more fortress than sanctuary. Grand halls. Defensive walls. Enough banquet space to entertain both God and several minor dukes. It was divine bureaucracy meets royal playground. Critics called it the Babylonian captivity, comparing the church's exile to the Jews in Babylon. Harsh? Maybe. But when your pope is surrounded by luxury and your flock is surrounded by plague and poverty, the optics aren't great. Letters of protest arrived from theologians. Writers penned essays with titles like "Please Come Back," though in Latin and less clingy. But the Avignon popes weren't in a rush. Rome was violent. Avignon had vineyards. Why return to a city where mobs stabbed cardinals in alleyways when you could debate morality over a cheese course? But paradise has its cracks. The papacy's credibility began to rot. Not from heresy, but from absence. And as each year passed, more began to ask. If the Pope no longer lives in Rome, is he still the Pope? Eventually, in 1377, under growing pressure, Pope Gregory XI returned to Rome, carried more by guilt and political exhaustion than divine revelation. It should have been a homecoming. Instead, it was a prelude to something worse. Because when Gregory died shortly after his return, the cardinals panicked. They tried to fix things, and accidentally broke everything. They elected one pope, then another, then a third. And just like that, the church went from one absentee father to a three-way custody battle. But we'll get there. For now, let's toast to the papacy's most luxurious sabbatical. A 70-year wine-soaked vacation that left Rome feeling very ghosted. Next up, 3 popes, 0 consensus, infinite drama. It's time for the Western schism. If 1 pope is divine authority and 2 popes are a theological headache, then 3 popes is officially what historians call a dumpster fire in Latin. But that's exactly where we find ourselves at the end of the 14th century, with 3 men in 3 different cities, each wearing the same hat and screaming, "I'm the real pope," louder than the others. No, this isn't a medieval joke. This is the Western schism, a decades-long crisis where the church split like an overripe fig and nobody knew who, exactly, was in charge of eternal salvation. It all started innocently enough. By papal standards. Pope Gregory XI had just died. You remember him, the guy who finally dragged the papacy back to Rome after 70 years of wine tastings in Avignon. Rome, understandably, was desperate to keep the throne. Mobs gathered. Torches flickered. Locals shouted, "An Italian pope, or else." Which is how elections always go best, under threat of arson. The terrified cardinals, mostly French, caved. They elected an Italian, Urban VI. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Urban turned out to be difficult. He scolded cardinals, accused everyone of plotting against him, and treated diplomacy like a blunt weapon. Even the French cardinals who voted for him regretted it almost immediately, which, in fairness, is how many bad relationships begin. So what did they do? They declared the election invalid, claimed they were pressured by Roman mobs, and elected a new pope, Clement VII, who conveniently lived in Avignon and had a much better wine cellar. Now there were 2 popes. Each excommunicated the other. Each claimed to be the true vicar of Christ. And Europe had to pick sides. France, Scotland, and Spain backed Avignon. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy stuck with Rome. Clergy were torn. Bishops confused. And the average peasant? Probably just wanted to know who was in charge of baptizing babies and blessing the bread. Years passed. Decades, actually. Popes died. Successors were elected. And still, the church staggered forward like a drunk wearing 2 different shoes. Then, in 1409, the church tried to fix the mess. Spoiler, they made it worse. A council in Pisa declared both popes deposed and elected a third, Alexander V. Neither of the other 2 stepped down. Now there were 3 popes, and none of them would shut up. Rome shouted, "I'm the true pope." Avignon shouted, "No, I am." Pisa cleared its throat and shouted, "Guys, I'm right here." It was like a custody battle for all of Christendom, except instead of deciding who gets the kids on weekends, they were deciding whose blessings actually counted. Church unity fractured. Salvation became a matter of geography. And the laity, bless them, just kept showing up to Mass hoping someone knew what was going on. Finally, in 1417, the Council of Constance pulled the holy band-aid. They pressured 2 popes to resign, deposed the third, and elected Martin V, a man with a nice beard and, more importantly, no strong enemies. The schism was over. At least, officially. But the scars ran deep. The church had spent nearly 40 years excommunicating itself in triplicate. Its moral authority? Battered. Its image? Shattered. Its credibility? Drenched in incense and political farce. Because when you spend decades arguing over hats and titles while the world burns, eventually people start asking, was any of this holy to begin with? Next up, a pope with children, mistresses, and murder on speed dial. Enter Rodrigo Borgia, a man so scandalous, he made all previous popes look like altar boys. If the papacy was a holy office, Rodrigo Borgia turned it into a luxury suite with a murder clause. He wasn't a shepherd of souls, he was a tactician in silk, a godfather with incense, and the man who made the word Borgia sound like a threat whispered across the confession booth. His election in 1492, yes, the same year Columbus sailed west in search of disaster, was not so much a divine appointment as a masterclass in bribery. Palaces were promised. Chests of gold discreetly changed hands. And one by one, cardinals looked at their spiritual integrity and traded it for beachfront property and lifetime pensions. Rodrigo became Pope Alexander VI, and Rome braced itself. He didn't arrive cloaked in mystery. He arrived cloaked in reputation. Mistresses? Yes. Children? Multiple. Confession? Rarely. Celibacy, it seemed, was a suggestion. One he ignored while hosting lavish feasts in the apostolic palace, where the wine flowed, the masks came off, and the whispers of orgies outnumbered the prayers. He openly acknowledged his children. Not metaphorically. Literally. Césaire, his son, made cardinal at 18, despite preferring armor over incense. Lucrezia, his daughter, married off like a strategic chess piece and dragged into so many scandals she became a Renaissance myth. The Borgia household was less a family and more a syndicate, running the papacy like a private empire. Church funds were rerouted to wars. Nephews were elevated. Enemies vanished. And the line between altar and battlefield blurred under Rodrigo's smiling gaze. Simony flourished. Land was seized. Pardons were sold like pastries. If you had enough gold, you could probably buy your way out of purgatory and get valet parking on the way to heaven. Critics accused him of everything from incest to poisoning. And the worst part? Some of it was probably true. Cardinals were rumored to test their food in front of animals first. Dinner parties ended with guests missing. And if you crossed the Borgia machine, odds were you'd be crossing the river Styx shortly after. Still, and here's the twist, Alexander VI was good at his job. Financially, he stabilized the Vatican. Politically, he expanded papal influence. Militarily, he was terrifyingly effective. He was the CEO the church never wanted to admit it needed, ruthless, brilliant, and utterly immune to shame. His papacy wasn't just a scandal. It was a brand. Rome was no longer ruled by piety. It was ruled by ambition wrapped in velvet and sealed with a ring. Alexander died in 1503, possibly of malaria, possibly of poison, possibly of karma. Even his death was suspicious. But his legacy? Unforgettable. The papacy, after him, could never pretend it hadn't tasted blood. Because once you've crowned a Borgia, the incense never quite hides the smell. And as we leave Rodrigo's crimson-stained court, we enter the reign of a pope who traded seduction for steel. A man who wore armor over robes and marched into battle not with prayers, but with cannons. Meet Julius II, the warrior pope. If Rodrigo Borgia was the godfather in a mitre, then Julius II was the general, one who didn't wait for enemies to sin. He hunted them down, in full plate armor, on horseback, not metaphorically, literally. This was a pope who didn't whisper prayers, he barked orders. He didn't walk softly and carry a big cross. He marched loudly and carried a siege engine. Born Giuliano della Rovere, Julius II came to the papacy in 1503 with one goal: make the church terrifying again. And if that meant shouting in Latin, kicking down the doors of disobedient cities, and turning the Vatican into a command center, so be it. He was called the warrior pope, but not as a joke. The man led troops into battle wearing armor over his papal vestments. He cursed like a dock worker, drank like a soldier, and treated diplomacy like a tavern brawl with better lighting. His enemies included France, Venice, rebellious cardinals, and occasionally logic. But he didn't care. He wanted the Papal States back, territory lost during the chaos of the Borgias, and he was going to take them. With armies, and banners, and a holy fury that made the Book of Revelation seem underfunded. Under Julius, the papacy was a military campaign wrapped in incense. He hired mercenaries, forged alliances, and personally oversaw sieges, marching through muddy fields and blood-soaked fortresses, muttering theology between volleys of cannon fire. Rome, of course, was horrified, and a little impressed. But Julius wasn't just a warrior. He was a patron. He commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, a job the artist hated. Julius climbed the scaffolding regularly, shouting critiques as Michelangelo worked upside down in paint-stained agony. He hired Raphael. He began the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica, tearing down the old church like it was yesterday's doctrine. His reign was loud, expensive, and furious. And underneath it all, Julius had a vision. A church not of meek shepherds and monks, but of kings. A Vatican that didn't just guide, it ruled. With armies, and frescoes, and terrifying confidence. He wore his papal crown like a helmet, and spoke of divine mercy like a general preparing for siege. His critics called him unholy. He called them irrelevant. In 1513, Julius died, not in battle, shockingly, but in bed, likely of fever, exhaustion, and sheer papal rage. He left behind a Rome strengthened, refortified, and echoing with the hammer of stone and steel. He was not kind. He was not gentle. But he was effective. And his legacy is still visible, not in words, but in walls. Because when you enter the Sistine Chapel and stare upward at the divine, just know, the ceiling exists because a pope threatened Michelangelo to finish it. Next, we meet the man who turned indulgences into currency, and accidentally started a revolution that shattered the church from the inside out. Prepare for Leo X, the pope who partied through the Reformation. If Julius II was a general in armor, Leo X was a prince in velvet slippers, sliding into the papacy with the grace of a Medici and the appetite of a man who'd never been told no. Born Giovanni de' Medici, he didn't just inherit power, he inhaled it. He was the first pope from the legendary Florentine banking dynasty, and his attitude toward the church was, how shall we put this? Casual, confident, catastrophic. When he became pope in 1513, he looked at the Vatican not as a sacred burden, but as an opportunity to host the most expensive dinner party in European history. His motto may as well have been, God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it. And enjoy it he did. The man had taste. He adored art, music, poetry, exotic animals, and anyone who could entertain him, preferably in Latin and in costume. He brought in elephants, musicians, court jesters, and more sculptors than saints. The papal palace became Versailles with incense. Feasts ran for days. And the treasury? Well, let's talk about that. See, Leo had a problem. Michelangelo was expensive. So was Raphael. So was building St. Peter's Basilica and buying new tapestries every time he got bored of the current ones. So Leo did what any good Renaissance CEO would do. He moneized forgiveness. Enter the indulgence industry, where sins could be scrubbed clean not with repentance, but with coin. The idea wasn't new, But under Leo, it reached retail levels. Priests traveled the countryside selling promises like carnival barkers. Step right up. Reduce your time in purgatory. Save your grandmother's soul. Forgive your affair and get a decorative scroll to prove it. And it worked. The money poured in. Until a German monk named Martin Luther watched it happen and muttered, "Absolutely not." In 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. It wasn't meant as a revolution, more like an angry blog post, a frustrated letter to corporate. But the printing press turned it viral. And suddenly, Leo's indulgent strategy looked less like clever fundraising and more like spiritual blackmail. How did Leo respond? He laughed. Literally. He called Luther a drunken German who will change his mind when sober. Then he went back to his banquet. Spoiler: Luther did not change his mind. Instead, he started the Protestant Reformation, a theological earthquake that split Europe in half, sent churches up in flames, and shattered the monopoly of the Roman Church. And Leo? He excommunicated Luther. Too late. The fire was already burning. The indulgence booths were empty, and the faithful were questioning everything. Leo died in 1521, reportedly from pneumonia, or gluttony, or the shock of realizing the Renaissance party was over. He left behind a church rich in art, and bankrupt in trust, because while the frescoes still glowed, and the music still echoed through the Vatican halls, a crack had formed, deep, permanent, and growing. The Reformation wasn't born from heresy. It was born from a church that forgot the weight of its own words. And Leo, for all his laughter and luxury, was the man holding the champagne flute when the ceiling finally cracked. And as the Vatican halls dimmed, echoing with the final notes of Renaissance arrogance, Europe looked east and west, seeking new lands to convert, conquer, or simply misunderstand. While popes feasted on eel and excommunicated monks from marble balconies, across the ocean, another empire was rising, not with silk, but with stone. Not with wine, but with sunlight. High in the Andes, the people of the sun were building something far more enduring than papal decrees. A civilization woven in gold, silence, and granite. No cathedrals, no cardinals, just the hum of sacred rivers and the breath of mountains older than any crown. And unlike Rome, they didn't sell salvation. They offered it to the gods, to the earth, to the fire beneath their feet. They were the Incas, and their story doesn't begin with conquest. It begins with light. You don't arrive at the Inca Empire. You ascend to it. Before it was a kingdom, or a story, or even a name, it was a breath in the mountains, a whisper through the valleys, a silence so ancient it pressed against your ribs and made you forget what noise ever felt like. The Andes don't rise. They loom, jagged, unsympathetic, carved by gods with no interest in comfort. It is here, in this vertical cathedral of wind and stone, that a people were born not from conquest, but from light. They called themselves the children of the sun. Not metaphorically, literally. According to legend, Manco Capac and Mama Oclo emerged from Lake Titicaca, not with swords, but with purpose. Sent by Inti, the sun god, their mission was clear. Bring order, bring structure, bring civilization to a world too wild to tame itself. They wandered with a golden staff, instructed to build their city where the earth swallowed it whole. They found that place in a fertile valley and called it Cusco. Not a city, a navel, the very center of the world. The Inca didn't believe they owned the land. They believed they belonged to it. They walked mountains like monks, each peak a spirit, each river a vein, each stone a whisper from the past. Unlike Rome, which paved and plundered, the Incas wove their empire. Gently, precisely, like threads in a sacred blanket. There were no wheels, no iron, no writing, and yet there was order, delicate, deliberate, stunning. Their language, Quechua, rolled like wind between peaks. Their crops climbed with them, potatoes, maize, quinoa, each planted in terraces that mirrored the curves of the mountains themselves. Agriculture as choreography, survival as symphony. They didn't pray at the sun. They lived with it. Temples weren't just built facing east. They sang with the dawn. Even time behaved differently here, not linear, but circular. Not a march, but a dance. To exist in the early Inca world was to live inside a dream carved in rock and lit from within. Not with candles, but with conviction. And high above the clouds, beyond the reach of empires that thought only in gold and conquest, a people waited. They weren't preparing for war. They were preparing to endure. If the Inca Empire had a heartbeat, it pulsed beneath Cusco. Not a city in the way we think of cities. Not blocks and borders and traffic plans. Cusco was a cosmic diagram, a sacred sketch drawn in stone, built to mirror the very shape of the universe, or at least the version the Inca believed they could trust. At the center stood the Coricancha, the temple of the sun. Its walls weren't merely golden. They reflected sunlight like a second dawn, blinding and divine, turning the entire city into a ritual every morning. The stones? Each cut so perfectly that not even a strand of hair could slip between them. No mortar, no glue, just precision, centuries ahead of its time, holding fast against earthquakes that would flatten European cathedrals like papier-mâché. From the air, if you could hover like a condor, Cusco looked like a puma. Not by accident. The city was alive. The head was Sacsayhuaman, a fortress of such unfathomable scale it makes modern engineers either weep or pretend not to notice. Massive zigzagging walls of cyclopean stones, each one the size of a small car, fitted with the grace of an apology. It was both citadel and symbol, the place where sky touched soil and dared not move. Every road in the empire began here. All of them. They radiated out like solar rays, connecting valleys, villages, mountains, coastlines. It was more than infrastructure. It was ideology cast in gravel and sweat. In Cusco, religion and administration overlapped. Priests were officials. Officials were priests. The divine was always watching, and bureaucracy had never been so spiritually lit. But Cusco was not merely a city of stone and sun. It breathed. Markets bustled with coca leaves, guinea pigs, woven textiles dyed in cochineal red. Messengers ran. Priests chanted. Children played in courtyards where the shadows of mountains leaned in like guardians. And all of it followed a rhythm, agricultural, astronomical, and imperial. Festivals unfolded like clockwork. Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun, where nobles paraded in feathers and gold, reenacting cosmic cycles beneath skies that barely blinked. They didn't perform to amuse. They performed to preserve, order, balance, gratitude. The people called it Cosco, not Cusco. It meant navel, the spiritual belly button of the world, where gods, ancestors, and mortals held hands in rotating silence. To the Spaniards who arrived later, it was merely a city to loot. To the Inca, it was a portal. And when they touched its walls, they didn't just feel stone. They felt memory. Because Cusco wasn't built to dominate. It was built to remember what held the sky in place. Empires are often measured by what they conquer. The Inca Empire was measured by what it connected. Stretching over 40,000 kilometers, the Capacnan, the Great Inca Road, didn't just link cities. It stitched together mountains, jungles, deserts, coastlines. Every step was a thread. Every curve, a conversation between earth and stone. And here's the marvel. They did it without wheels. No carts, no horses, no chariots thundering over cobblestones. Only feet and the memory of the land beneath them. The roads climbed mountains like they were born from them, not laid on top, but grown into the earth's skin. Suspension bridges of woven grass arched over canyons so deep they looked like forgotten gods breathing holes. They rebuilt them yearly, like rituals with rope and rhythm. No blueprints, just knowledge passed through hands. The empire didn't rely on roads. The empire was the road. Every village, every terrace, every distant outpost was connected to Cusco. A beating heart with stone arteries, carrying messages, grain, soldiers, silence. And who carried those messages? Not birds, not scrolls, but chasquis, human messengers trained like marathoners, moving in relays that spanned the empire like lightning on foot. They ran with quipus, strings of knots carrying data no outsider could decode. They memorized spoken reports, names, numbers, instructions, and recited them with terrifying precision. Way stations called tambos dotted the road every 20 kilometers. Rest stops, yes, but also command posts, storage units, and shelters for tired feet. Like veins with resting valves, the road never slept. There were no traffic jams, only wind and time. Some of the roads were paved with fine stone, others with dirt. Some climbed so high that the air itself hesitated. But all of them worked. The Spaniards, upon arrival, marveled at it. They walked these roads to invade, to plunder, to preach, never realizing they were guests on a path more sacred than any sermon. Because for the Inca, travel wasn't just motion. It was a ritual. Movement itself was order, and the roads weren't just practical. They were cosmic. Their empire didn't need wheels because it had legs trained by ancestors and lungs made of altitude. And when the empire finally fell, the roads remained, not just as relics, but as echoes. Because stone forgets slowly, and footsteps don't lie. You might think it's impossible to rule an empire without money, lawyers, or angry letters from bureaucrats. The Incas would disagree, politely, with a bundle of maize and a very well-woven tunic. Because while Rome taxed with coins and crowns, the Inca taxed with time. They called it mita, not slavery, not charity, but a communal obligation. Every citizen owed labor to the empire. Some planted potatoes, others built roads, others polished the temples where the sun liked to rest. Payment? Not gold, not silver, but food, cloth, and reciprocity. If your village built a bridge this year, the state might send you llamas and corn next year. If your family served in the army, they might be compensated with textiles and storage rights from the nearest granary. It wasn't capitalism, nor was it communism. It was something ancient, pulsing, cooperative, alive. The Inca government functioned more like a circulatory system than a throne. Every region had a role. Every person had a purpose. No one was idle, which sounds lovely until you realize free time didn't really exist. Work was sacred, rest was collective, and idleness was considered suspicious at best, heretical at worst. At the top of this highly efficient food and fabric pyramid sat the Sapa Inca, the emperor, the divine son of the sun. He didn't campaign. He didn't bargain. He commanded, as one does when one is technically half god. Below him, a network of officials oversaw the daily pulse of the empire, from the nobility to the Caracas, local leaders, each one responsible for quotas, rituals, and the general sense that the cosmos was humming along properly. And below them, the commoners, farmers, herders, builders, potters. They were the lungs and hands of the state, and their labor was not optional. But it was organized with terrifying precision. Storage facilities called quolcas dotted the landscape, huge stone silos packed with dried potatoes, maize, salted fish, beans, and woven goods. These weren't just reserves for bad harvests. They were proof that the gods approved of the government. And it worked. There were no homeless, no famines, at least not until the Spanish arrived. Because the Inca system understood reciprocity as survival. They didn't send soldiers to crush rebellion every week. They sent food, cloth, and engineers. And if you accepted their gifts, you became Inca, not by blood, but by grain and thread. In their world, in the Andes, wealth didn't glitter. It fed. And power wasn't shouted. It was woven into your tunic and your soil. When the Spaniards came looking for gold and maps, they found an empire held together by something they couldn't steal. Trust in a system older than coin. Because when the empire finally cracked, it wasn't from within. It was because the world outside didn't believe you could rule without chains. No empire survives on good intentions and pretty stones. Somewhere, someone has to count the corn. And for the Inca, math didn't live in books. It lived in knots. They called it the quipu, a bundle of strings, each dyed a different color, twisted and knotted in ways that looked, to outsiders, like something a bored child might tie to a llama's tail. But these weren't decorations. They were archives. Imagine a spreadsheet woven from thread, a census made of string, an inventory that you could touch. Each knot meant something, a 1, a 10, 100. Each string color might refer to maize, or llamas, or land. Each position told a story, not in syllables, but in structure. There was no alphabet, no ink, only memory, math, and material. Quipucamayaks, keepers of the knots, were trained to read this tactile language like others read sacred texts. They didn't stare at numbers. They felt them. They ran their fingers down the strings like priests performing rituals. And in a way, they were. Each quipu was a ritual of record-keeping, a sacred dance between data and divine order. The knots tracked taxes, harvests, marriages, deaths, weather, battles. They were the empire's servers, except you couldn't hack them, unless you had really sharp scissors and no fear of curses. Most empires trusted their past to ink. The Inca trusted flesh and thread. To the Inca, record-keeping wasn't dull procedure. It was sacred order woven in thread. To them, knowledge was not something you buried in libraries. It was something you carried, physically, communally, across valleys and generations. But when the Spanish arrived, they saw only string. They couldn't decode it, so they called it pagan nonsense and burned most of it. Thousands of quipus vanished into smoke, entire histories unwritten and unread, simply because they weren't written the right way. The tragedy isn't just that we lost their records. It's that we lost their logic. A logic that trusted hands over parchment, silence over speech, form over fiction. And somewhere, in the highlands, maybe a single quipu survives. waiting to be read by fingers that remember how to feel truth in a knot. Because not every story is told with words. Some are braided, looped, and hanging in the dark, whispering, "We were here." The Spanish called it El Dorado, the golden one, the dream, the lie, because when they stumbled into the Andes, they saw cities that shimmered, temples that glowed, and palaces that caught sunlight like mirrors made by gods. To them, this wasn't just impressive. It was an invitation. But for the Inca, gold wasn't currency. It was sunlight made solid. They didn't melt it into coins. They didn't hoard it in banks. They molded it into offerings, masks, animals, flowers, altars, tributes to Inti, the sun god who gave them life, crops, and breath. To steal gold from a temple was like stealing a priest's heartbeat. To the Inca, gold wasn't treasure, it was a hymn cast in metal. The Coricancha, the temple of the sun in Cusco, was lined with sheets of gold that shimmered not with greed, but with devotion. Statues of llamas, corn, and children stood in ceremonial poses, not to impress emperors, but to remind the gods that humans hadn't forgotten where warmth came from. Gold was never used in markets. It never bought bread or tools or land. Its only value was symbolic, cosmic, sacred. So when the conquistadors arrived with their helmets and hunger, they didn't just misunderstand the Inca economy. They misread the soul of the civilization. They melted down suns. They dismantled meaning. They turned holy light into loot. And yet, for all their fires and furnaces, they could never explain why a civilization so wealthy didn't build vaults, didn't count coins, didn't crave gold the way Europe did, with fever and knives. Because the Inca didn't need gold to prove power. They had roads, harvests, temples, people. Power wasn't in metal. It was in balance. They gave gold to the earth, to the rivers, to the mountains. And when they buried it in offerings, it wasn't lost. It was returned. It's easy to scoff at this now, in a world where gold backs currencies and wedding rings and startup investments. But maybe the Inca saw something we didn't. Maybe they knew the sun couldn't be owned, only honored, only borrowed. And when you try to carry sunlight in your pocket, it burns a hole through everything you thought you understood about value. Most empires rule with force. The Inca ruled with geometry. Not the cold kind you hated in school. Triangles on paper and lifeless equations. This was sacred geometry. Living, breathing math, mapped in mountains, measured by sunbeams, and obeyed not because of fear, but because the universe said so. Their capital, Cusco, wasn't just shaped like a puma because it looked cool. It was an offering, a symbol, a prayer written in city blocks and alleyways. Each building faced a star. Each corner answered a god. The Inca calendar didn't tick in months. It spiraled through solstices and harvests. Time wasn't a straight line. It was a choreography between humans and heavens. Every year, during Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun, thousands gathered to reenact the birth of the world, not metaphorically, but as cosmic maintenance. If they didn't honor the sun might stop shining. And that was not a theory. That was policy. Priests didn't just bless crops. They studied stars, tracked shadows, predicted rains. Temples weren't built to house gods. They were machines of light. Their windows aligned perfectly with the solstices. Their walls resonated with the pulse of seasons. Step inside the right room at the right moment, and you wouldn't just see sunlight, you'd see divine confirmation. Even the mountains, Apis, they called them, weren't just rock. They were spirits, ancestors, watchers. You didn't mind them. You fed them. Sacrifices weren't punishment. They were contracts, intimate, heartbreaking, often beautiful. Not just blood, but food, cloth, music, breath. Sometimes, yes, even children, chosen not because they were unloved, but because they were believed to be the most worthy. The Inca believed that the empire worked because the cosmos approved. And the cosmos only approved if humans kept their end of the rhythm. This wasn't religion as suggestion. It was governance through awe. Imagine a state where a bad harvest wasn't blamed on the economy, but on a misaligned solstice ceremony. It sounds primitive, until you realize how stable it made them. While Europe bled over doctrine and crown, the Inca choreographed obedience with festivals, color, and ritualized gratitude. Power wasn't loud. It was precise. And when that power failed, it wasn't because the gods abandoned them. It was because someone, somewhere, missed a beat. Because in an empire ruled by the sun, the worst thing you could do was cast a shadow. Some empires build walls. The Inca built trust. Not the sentimental kind. Not hugs and handwritten letters. Trust, here, meant mutual obligation, a political spell cast through food, shelter, and the quiet pressure of not disappointing your ancestors. There were no prisons in the Inca Empire. Not because crime didn't exist, but because society was so interwoven that exile felt worse than bars. If you stole, you weren't locked up. You were cut off. From land, from food, from festivals. And in a culture where life meant connection, that was a fate worse than confinement. The Inca didn't build defensive walls around cities, because they didn't need to keep people out. They focused on keeping people within, not by force, but by function. Rebellion was rare, not because of fear, because of design. The MITA system meant everyone had a role. From the noblest artisan to the potato farmer scratching at a hillside, everyone's labor mattered, visibly, tangibly, daily. Every family belonged to an Ailu, a kin-based community unit that shared land, work, and resources. The Ailu wasn't optional. It was identity. If one member suffered, all worked to support them. If one member slacked, all noticed. It was a system of mirrors, and no one liked seeing their reflection crack. Leadership wasn't elected, exactly. It was cultivated. Local leaders, Caracas, rose from within, knew the land, the rituals, the people. They weren't faraway kings. They were neighbors with calendars. When expansion happened, and it did, massively, the Inca didn't burn cities. They offered infrastructure, terraces, roads, festivals, storage, and people said, yes. Not because they were conquered, because they were included. Resistance did happen, in places where local gods refused to kneel, where geography bred stubbornness. But even then, violence was the last resort, not the first. The Inca believed in assimilation through abundance. Not just taking land, making that land work better. They didn't build castles. They built granaries. They didn't train torturers. They trained engineers. Because in a world where survival hangs on every harvest, loyalty isn't bought with swords. It's earned with storage and sunlight. So when the Spaniards marched in with armor and cannons, they expected fortresses. Instead, they found cooperation. And that terrified them. Because how do you conquer an empire that doesn't fear you? How do you subjugate people who don't need chains to obey? The Inca didn't fall because they lacked walls. They fell because the world that came for them didn't understand silence, balance, or unwritten laws. It didn't happen with a battle cry. It happened with a handshake. Francisco Pizarro arrived with fewer than 200 men. The Inca Empire had millions. And yet, within a few years, it was over. No cinematic duel on a mountaintop. Just disease, betrayal, and the audacity of belief. You see, the Spaniards believed they had a right, divine, imperial, theological, to take what they saw. And the Inca? They believed the visitors were gods. Or at least, the first wave did. They had no precedent for people who killed during diplomacy. No ritual for dealing with steel, germs, and horses all at once. No script for men who didn't honor the sun but worshipped gold. Atahualpa, the last sovereign emperor, was captured in a courtyard, not on a battlefield. He offered rooms filled with treasure for his release. He fulfilled the promise. The Spanish killed him anyway. His death didn't just silence a man. It announced a new kind of empire. The rules had changed. Sacred space meant nothing. Trust was a liability. The Spanish brought smallpox before they brought swords. Entire villages died before they ever saw a helmet. Healers fell. Priests collapsed. Entire Alis withered into silence. And still, some resisted. Manco Inca rebelled, building a new capital in Vilcabamba, deep in the forest. A ghost empire, flickering in the trees, too stubborn to die with dignity. But the writing was already on the walls of gold. Melted, shipped, repurposed for Spanish cathedrals that never once asked the sun for permission. The roads that once pulsed with runners and harvests now carried foreign flags and forced conversions. Temples became churches. Ceremonies became crimes. Gods became demons overnight. The empire didn't collapse. It was unwritten, slowly, systematically, until it became a myth people told about a people who had once listened to the stars. And the tragedy wasn't just conquest. It was amnesia. Because when you erase the rituals, the calendars, the language, the quipus, the songs, you don't just defeat a people. You haunt them. Today, tourists take selfies where emperors once whispered to the cosmos. Souvenir stands line the plazas once painted with prayer. And the ghosts? They watch, quietly, from the mountains, still listening, still waiting. Not for revenge, but for remembrance. Because empires don't truly die when their leaders fall. They die when no one asks what they meant. You'd think the story ends here. With broken temples, burned quipus, and gold rebranded as European victory. But some stories refuse to close their doors. They stay open, like old wounds, or old windows facing east. Because while the empire fell, the sun never left. It still rises over Cusco, still touches the terraces of Machu Picchu with fingers of light, still wakes the Andes with the same golden hush that once kissed the face of emperors. The old gods were never evicted. They were rebranded. Inti became a saint's candle. The Apis became landscape photography. The sacred became scenic. But in the highlands, people still whisper to the corn, still trace the stars, still bury coca leaves in the dirt with quiet apologies and even quieter prayers. Some children still learn Quechua before Spanish. Some elders still remember the solstice by the tilt of a shadow on stone. No apps, no clocks, just memory and sky. The Inca don't exist on maps anymore, but they exist in motion. In every step on the Capacnan, in every harvest shared without price, in every grandmother who points at a mountain and says, "That's not a rock. That's my ancestor." Because legacy isn't always written in laws or history books. Sometimes it's tucked into fabric, knit into patterns too old to translate, too familiar to forget. You don't need a flag to be a nation. You need rhythm, and the Andes still beat with it. A pulse you can't see from space, but you can feel it if you're quiet, if you listen, if you walk instead of conquer. So no, the sun didn't abandon them. It simply hid in plain sight. In a world that worships progress, they left behind something older. Continuity. And maybe that's the real empire. Not stone, not gold, but a way of being that outlives conquest. So next time the sun hits your face just right, don't thank science. Thank a people who once believed that light wasn't a fact. It was a promise. And some promises never burn out. And now, as the echoes of empires quiet down, as the gold melts into dreams and the sun finds rest behind the hills, you can let go of the questions. Let the silence speak for once. Let the mountains keep their secrets, and the gods, old or new, watch without judgment. Close your eyes. There's nothing left to conquer tonight. No thrones to chase. No temples to build. No ghosts to outrun. Just you, and a quiet sky that remembers more than books ever could. Thank you for walking this road with me. Sleep well, and may the warmth of forgotten suns find you in your dreams. Good night.